Okay, so we are back to Truth and Truth Makers. This is the Abstract Particulars. Karen, Josh, Kenny, and myself, Rodrigo, reading through an anthology or two on Truth Makers. And for today, we read David Lewis's, I forgot the title, Difference Making, Truth Making and Difference Making. To see what the modal realist, when he's pretending that it doesn't matter about, to see what he has to offer to the matter. Let's get to it. My own thoughts were that it's classic Lewis, first of all, very, very precise, very enjoyable. But I think the problems he's trying to solve are not problems that I anticipated or that I'm yet convinced we have. So I think my focus will be on trying to understand why he makes the how he draws the conclusions about what must follow from the truth maker principle, such that he must go through these contortions to accommodate it, and maybe also how his ideas relate to two other ideas. One, that of real entailment in Greg Bristol, in particular his way of speaking of worlds, which is not the same worlds as what Lewis is talking about, but which I think bear upon the argument. And second, my own ideas about how complements of extensions might provide what we need for false makers. Other than that, I very much liked his genetic analysis of unicorns. What did you think, Josh?
What did I think? That's a good question. I guess I'm a bit confused because in my mind, the truth maker work is, and maybe this goes back to our disagreement, our 50-50 disagreement about what the paper was about last week. But it seems to me like the work for truth makers has to do between the real thing, the truth maker, and some proposition. But the paper was focusing on second order logic to quantify over these relations. And so I guess I'm trying to understand how possible worlds and propositions and, all the work he's doing is relating to this like truth making relationship. I guess I was sort of unclear, like, because he even says, it gets down to necessitation and this, this, and I'm like, yeah, exactly. So what are we doing? Like, what? I guess I'm just a little confused about what problem specifically he's trying to solve. I guess I understand the false maker part, and you need this difference maker. I thought that was a really interesting exploration of difference making, but still, that seems to be an additional problem apart from just this entailment relationship between the thing in the world and the proposition that it makes true. So yeah, I guess I'm hoping to kind of get from this conversation what he thinks he's doing and why maybe that's necessary, no pun intended. Because it seems like we need to get to logic, and it just kind of starts off with second order logic, and I'm just wondering how we're going from the thing in the world to the proposition, and then
Wait,
I'm just
second
a little
order
bit.
logic, or do you mean modal logic?
Well, no, because he specifically says we need second order logic to quantify over the relationships, right? Not just the objects, but
Oh,
the
that part, yeah.
relationships.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm thinking, well, no, but that's just, you need propositions at that point to do any kind of logic, right? So how do we even get to that point? And that's where last week we had, the difficulty around the existence propositions as kind of the starting point. And in my mind, the starting point is really just the thing in the world to that existence proposition.
Yeah,
So yeah, just a little
I have
clear about what.
some. Yeah, I have a lot of the same concerns and agree with much of what you said. But I will correct you on one major thing. We met 2 weeks ago, not 1 week ago.
Oh, that's right. We did.
Karen?
Nobody online knows.
Yeah, I had, or did you say Kenny or Karen?
Karen, yeah.
Karen, okay, yeah. I was really frustrated when I first read this paper because it seemed like he was saying all these crazy things that were obviously not true. And then in the second part of the paper, he's like, but the things I've just said are obviously not true for these crazy reasons. And I'm like, yeah. So I agree with Josh. It'd be good to go through this and see exactly what his project is and what he's doing. I guess it again, and this is part of my frustration from, I guess, yes, 2 weeks ago, is to explain the connection between things, propositions, such that things can make propositions true. Whereas things is, a pretty big word that can include maybe states of affairs or absences. I don't know. To understand that in terms of entailment and necessitation, if that brings in the framework of worlds, it just seems like it's bringing way too much, and it just creates all kinds of problems. And 2 weeks ago we saw the problems with think necessary truths, right, which are going to be in any world you talk about. So you're talking about what makes it true that the cat is on the mat, and suddenly 2 + 2 = 4 rears its ugly head or its beautiful head. Right? And that's what's going to happen if you do your work with worlds, right? Because they got a lot of stuff in them besides cats and mats. And so it just seems like, if you are a modal realist and you really have this framework and you want to try and cash out truth makers with it, you create a lot of problems that you have to, address. But it just makes me think you never should have employed that framework to try and understand truth makers. As Joshua was saying, we're working to that. We're not going to use that to explain this basic stuff. The basic stuff is hopefully going to allow us to understand things like propositions and how they work. And then we can come up with ideas about, worlds of propositions. And
okay, so once again, Karen and I are in the same possible world.
In my world, you're on the left-hand side of the screen. Is that true for you too?
no, I'm diagonal from Joshua.
You're okay.
Oh.
There's no Brady Bunch consistency between these
no Brady
worlds.
Bunch consistency. I can't.
You two are on the
I can't pass
bottom
my
right,
Apple
so-
pencil down to him, but I just stabbed Kenny in the head as they're arranged.
Yeah, okay.
I left mine back in North America. Kenny, what do you think?
I mean, yeah, it was definitely classic Lewis. I mean, the opening is like, it's just so, I don't even know how to describe it. You can just always tell it's Lewis.
He doesn't
He
need
just has a certain,
bylines.
no, he doesn't. Yeah, he just has a certain voice that comes out. Yeah.
And he always mentions his cat.
Yeah, right. That's right. Yeah. So I'm not exactly sure how to place this paper in relation to all the other ones that we've read as well yet. I mean, I'll be curious to hear what everybody else thinks as we go through it. I think that the idea of difference making, it seems like it's a sort of complementary. So it's sort of like a complementary notion to the truth maker principle, or TM. And I mean, and in that respect, it's sort of intuitive enough, but it's also not clear. In a way, there's a lot of the successive problems and refinements and that come up through the paper seem to me to just indicate, and to some extent he even acknowledges this at the beginning, that maybe a framework like was it Restall's or somebody else's who had who redefined what the worlds were in terms of truth makers, and had a real entailment or whatever.
Yes, that's Restall. That's last week. Last week.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Last week. That sort of thing, having a sort of finer grained individuation seems to me to be sort of like what is sort of wanted, or it seems like that's the motivation for trying to bring out the fine detail of, well, are objects enough, or do we have to add in properties or other second order considerations in order to get the right principle formulated. It just seems as though the work is just moving in the direction towards a theory which is going to be quite like some sort of relevance theory. But yeah, so I don't know. I'm not sure yet how I come down on this, but we'll see how it goes.
Okay. It's worth mentioning that Kenny
Also-
and I, the other reading group that we're doing is on truth, according to Davidson. And in our very last reading, he basically commits himself to oppose the Truthmaker program, although he doesn't reference it because it came immediately before. His paper comes immediately before the ones that we're reading now. But it's interesting that we're seeing both coming in parallel, both projects in parallel. And he has a lot to say about convention T, which is what's all over this first page.
Yeah. Yes, actually, I did notice that. I was thinking about that because there's a part where Lewis says something that Davidson almost certainly rejects. Well, actually, I should not speak too quickly, but I wasn't sure. The bit about the a priori is not. I don't know what Davidson would think about that. But,
wait, does Lewis say it's a priori? What are you talking about? Oh yeah, there it is right there.
Yeah, trivial, necessary, and knowable a priori.
I mean, yeah, of course he would have a problem with that, but
yeah,
I mean, Lewis here is referencing the principle as laid out by the Australians, and they just don't have the Quinean misgivings that Davidson is maintaining. So I don't think it's really so important for this particular issue, this particular project. Davidson could replace that by just, a central theory or whatever.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, I think the point that Lewis is beginning with is mainly that whatever truth is, we begin with these biconditionals. And the way he wrote them, I thought was really nice, because in the first expression of them, there's only one, the first list, there's only one biconditional at the top, right? And then the rest is just one big disjunction. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And there's also no quotation. It's all indirect, right? Yeah. Basically, it's not linguistic. He just makes outright reference to propositions. And and this gets us already into, I mean, despite the reservations by Josh and Karen, this gets us immediately into possible worlds, because of course, for Lewis, propositions just are classes of worlds. A position that was outright denied and dismissively by Armstrong. In fact, I remember when I read that, I thought, yeah, I'm going to give up on this too. And now I don't remember why I said that. But what I do remember is a general feeling that there's something wrong with having to decide between propositions as merely abstract objects, like abstractions from sentences on the one hand, or classes of worlds on the other, but that instead it should be something like the relationship between them, insofar as they are essentially representational. And that's what I stayed with. And that comes up in my reading of this paper as well. His setting aside representation to focus on the relationships between worlds and their parts, and whatever might be said about the Truthmaker principle, I think motivates a lot of the reasoning here.
Are you talking about the Armstrong paper that we read? Did we read?
I think so.
No, yeah, no, I thought what was the concern that not that propositions are sets of worlds, but that possible worlds are sets of propositions. So for Armstrong, they couldn't explain the relationship. They couldn't explain, so propositions are the things that are true, and we're trying to explain what makes them true. And it doesn't seem informative to say other propositions.
Yeah, maybe that is what he said.
So
but
yeah,
what I thought
if
was about propositions.
Possible worlds are sets,
yeah.
Right? Yeah, if propositions are sets of if possible worlds are sets of propositions that where where you have all the propositions possible, and there's either they're true or false, then that is not going to be a good thing to account for what makes propositions true or false. Is, well, are they assigned the value of true or false? Like
Yeah, I do remember him saying that, but I think I also remember his making reference to regarding propositions as classes of worlds and finding fault with that as well. And the reflections I had were really in response to both, because it seems to me, oh well, maybe this is the wrong dispute. Are propositions to be conceived of in terms of worlds, or worlds in terms of propositions? Maybe we just need to sustain both, neither being reduced to the other, and instead relate them by the truth-making relation, and just leave it at that. You see what I'm saying?
Right. So we better get the truth maker down without the possible world stuff.
Well, no, you can still involve worlds, but the propositions should not be themselves just worlds, but something else.
Okay.
But that's as far as I got. These are just intuitions I'm sharing. These aren't arguments. But they're intended to maybe create some distance between at least this conception of propositions, and further motivate the urgency of coming up with the truth maker theory. That's really the point.
Okay.
So I think the most startling thing that he says at the beginning for me was when he says that on 103, that the deflationary conception and the grand theory, a grand theory of truth, coexists peacefully. But by taking them together, we find that the grand theory was not, after all, a theory about truth. It was a theory of many things. It was a theory of the talking of a donkey, the flying of pigs, the praying of cats, and much else. He says this because he's able to rewrite the corollaries of a truth theory in light of the truth-making principle, without reference to truth in the actual instances of the schema. I mean, he just does it differently, so that it ends up not being about truth, but about the miscellany instantiations. And ultimately, this leads to the difference principle, although not right away. Did you get that feeling? Like at the bottom,
yeah, I mean,
at the top of 104, he says, I don't think these theories are theories about truth. They are theories of many things. The truth is just an abbreviatory device.
right. I mean, that does sound very inflationary, that the truth is an abbreviatory device.
Right. Well, and also because he says where grand theory comes in is, I mean, you start out with the biconditionals that he states out on 102, things like the proposition that a donkey talks is true if and only if a donkey talks, the proposition that pigs fly is true if and only if pigs fly, the proposition that cats purr is true if and only if cats purr. And then you come up with a theory of what truth is. And so if you think that truth is some property that the propositions have, then you apply it to this deflationary concept, and you get a donkey talks if the proposition that a donkey talks, if and only if the proposition that a donkey talks satisfies this condition X, of pigs fly, if and only if the proposition that pigs fly satisfies X. So we're just learning about different propositions and their properties, right? But so that's learning about a lot of different things. Like, how interesting that this, you know, this proposition, like if you learn what's good, what tastes good in a salad, you might learn about a lot of different things, right? Who knew? Oranges taste good in a salad. Sometimes mushrooms taste good in a salad. Sometimes water chestnuts taste good in a salad. You're learning about all kinds of foods. You're learning about oranges. You're learning about water chestnuts. You're learning about that they have this property of tasting good in a salad. So
Yeah, I'm not sure.
whereas
I'm not exactly.
you might have thought truth was learning about one thing, right? But really you're learning all these interesting facts about the things that are true.
Yeah, but I guess it's not clear why the X condition shouldn't just be understood to be, you know, as some sort of analysis of truth.
Thank you, Kenny.
I
I was thinking the exact same thing. I was trying to
Yeah.
understand what you're saying at face value, but then thinking, wouldn't that just be analysis of truth?
What I mean is, I mean, whenever you see something like that, I suppose you can read it in two ways. You can read it in a sort of eliminativist way, or you can read it in a reductionist way. It's not clear to me why this is supposed to somehow show us that truth was just abbreviatory, as much, you know, as instead of, I mean, maybe the issue is that maybe the issue here is to do with Tarski, actually, right? Like, in a sense, in the sense that maybe it's that we haven't abstracted well enough. I mean, but, you know, you could just say P if and only if the proposition that P satisfies X, and that would seem to be sufficiently general. I guess I'm just not sure. There's something probably, you know, in Lewis's background that is motivating this, but it's not clear to me why it couldn't just be, you know, an accounting of truth, whatever that satisfies X condition is. Or at least
no, he's not saying it's not an accounting of truth, just the opposite. He's saying that it's deflationary and grand, okay, in the sense that it is something more than merely what, well, the traditional deflationary theorists say. There is an element of correspondence, possibly, if that's his take. I think it is. But it's also merely abbreviatory about that correspondence.
I guess my point is, I don't think that the grand theorists take their theories to be abbreviatory.
Right.
They take their theories to be about truth and not about many things which are not truth.
About donkeys, pigs,
Right.
and cats.
He says the deflationary account and the grand theory account coexist. Therefore, the grand theory must not have been a theory of truth. I mean, he just says it, and I couldn't really follow the steps.
Well,
right, it starts above. It starts on page 102.
The point is that
103.
It's
well, 103 starts laying the foundedness of propositions, right? Some propositions cannot be named by that clause. It keeps going, and then on 103, so the story of truth cannot be told completely, but there's no need to complete it. The untold part merely repeats the same pattern over and over, so a tiny sample tells all we need to know, and he builds up this deflationary account, which coexists with the grand theory. Therefore, the grand theory must not be a theory of truth. And I was like, wait, but I don't quite see that shift right there. Mm-hmm. But it all seems to depend on this ungroundedness on page 102 at the bottom.
Yeah, I mean, because the ungroundedness.
he just
Do you
started.
think that's what it is?
Well, I don't. I honestly don't know. I could not figure out exactly what he was getting at here. Or if I did, I forgot because I read it 2 weeks ago.
Sure. Yeah. No. I mean, the caveats that he enumerates, having to do with the that clauses, I guess is just, yeah. I'm not exactly sure what the purpose of that is either.
But whatever it is, he says this is the conception of truth called deflationary by Horwich and Solms, and
Mhm.
then he shows that it coexists with the grand theory. Therefore, the grand theory must be truth. That seems to be the argument for him.
Right. Yeah, I think the idea here again is that when you say something like unicorns exist as false or dogs exist as true, you're not learning about some magical property called truth. You're learning something about dogs and unicorns.
Right.
No,
And
you're also
so,
learning about truth. I mean, truth is the predicate is in the statements. No, I think the reason he doesn't want to call
no,
it a
it's
grand theory.
but it's right. I mean, but he says that the theories about, when that theories that explain that are telling you what it is that dogs have that unicorns don't have.
Mhm.
Right. Theories about truth are really true, are theories about what dogs have that unicorns lack.
Yeah, but the reason he has to mention dogs and unicorns is because there isn't, as he says at the top of one of the three, he says the story of truth cannot be told completely. Okay, there's no need to complete it. The untold part merely repeats the same pattern over and over again. So a tiny sample tells us all we need to know. If the story could be told completely, that is, if it could be stated without ellipses, then you'd have a theory of truth. So that what's missing is a way to make this thing finite, and ideally
I'm
without
not.
reference
Right. And
to.
that, so that, yeah.
And ideally without reference to pigs and cats and unicorns, but that's the best we have.
And that's because of the deflationary theory of truth, right? Because so if you're in the kitchen and you want a theory of what's going to make your dish more salty, it might be that everything in your kitchen that's going to do that role has one thing in it: sodium. So you're really trying to identify a single thing that all of these things have in common. But if you're exploring what tastes good in a salad, then there's no one single thing that all those things have. You're going to have to learn something about apples and how they go in a salad, or something about pears and how they go in a salad. And so there's just going to be this list of all the things in your kitchen and whether or not you can make them work in a salad. And so you're learning about all the things in your kitchen, and it's different than just sort of learning about one thing that is shared by the things that can do this.
Yeah,
So truth is not like salt. Truth is like, just because of the deflationary account where it's this big long disjunction. But if you had a non-deflationary account of truth, then presumably that plus a theory of truth might not.
I think you're right, except that of course we can have a theory of salad because not everything. I mean, like you don't put concrete in salad, but I think the image is right in that.
Well, unicorns
the theory
are
about
not.
all it's a theory about all the things, about the pigs and the unicorns, and being a theory about all the things as well as truth is hardly what we wanted from the. It turns out not to be a theory specifically about truth, but about everything.
Right, but the theory about what will make things salty could also be a theory of everything. If it's tied to one single common ingredient, salts, a small category of chemicals that are taste salty to humans.
Well, how is it not just a theory about salts?
Because the answer is no. Adding sugar will not make it taste more salty. That's part of the theory.
Yeah, but those are the negative case.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess what I don't get is why is this X condition just, the sodium, the common sodium. So,
yeah, I think it's because of it's because of the deflationary nature of truth. that it's more like questions what goes in a salad. There really isn't a common ingredient for all the things that go well in a salad.
So
Because
Yeah.
when you look at salt, you've got a very few chemical things that we taste as salty, right? But when you look at a deflationary account of truth and you say, what is truth? And you say something like, well, let me tell you about truth. Pig's fly is true of pig's fly. So-and-so is true and so-and-so. It's more like, okay, you can make a good salad out of this. You can make a good salad out of this. You can make a good salad out of this. And it's just like a whole long list. And there's no common thing between pigs flying and cats being on mats that is the equivalent of the sodium. So when you get that deflationary account of truth and you're left with just pigs flying and cats on mats, there's no sodium to tie them together such that your grand theory can point to it. Right. And when there's no sodium, when you're just left with this like big, mess of possibilities, then what you're really learning about is all these different possibilities, right? You're never going to find the sodium, but you're going to learn a lot about what goes in a salad. You'll learn about apples, pears. It's hard to make a good salad with, I don't know, tripe, but some people do it. I don't know, it might be limits. Unedible things, keep them out of your salad for the most part.
Most chefs know it's like salt, fat, acid is what makes something tasty, right?
Right.
Before you learn the sort of why, you just learn a bunch of recipes that are good, right? You learn that restaurant's good, this dish is good, this dish is good, this recipe is good. But then if you get more skilled, you understand that it's this balance of salt, acid, fat. That's why something is good, right? That's why that tastes good. And he's saying you're not going to get down to salt, fat, acid. You're going to get down to just listing all the things that are tasty.
Right.
And you'll just never get into it.
And so studying cooking is learning about all that. So
learning about all of that.
So when I went into the world and became a philosopher and dedicated my life to truth, I'm going to learn a lot about unicorns and dogs. For example, I'm going to learn that dogs, it's true to say they exist, and so yeah, and that's good because you can be a philosopher and study absolutely everything and say you're doing your work, right?
I guess
I think that's an accurate reading of his take on the convention T. But then he also wants to say that there is something we can aim at without aiming at everything by way of the Truthmaker principle.
Yeah, is it this? I guess abbreviate. Is it also? It's a way of abbreviating the kinds of things you learn when you think about these issues with possible worlds. Maybe, I don't know. Yeah,
basically, so that you don't have to talk about whatever. Cabbages and kings, right? And you can just focus on something.
How much of this has to do with the fact that we're giving a list of biconditionals as opposed to general statement versus the fact that that listing of statements doesn't contain the truth predicate.
Oh,
is it because I'm just not sure that the enumeration issue is the reason why he's saying that it can't be that it isn't a theory of truth.
It's just
the reason why he's saying that is because when you combine it, you get statements about things which I guess he's trying to say are not truth.
I think it's both. Like that. I think it's both.
Well, I think it is truth, but it's just that when you get this list, you're not getting a thing in common. You're getting a list.
I think that the X is what's in common.
No, I don't think so.
The satisfies X is what's in common. Isn't it?
Well, that
enumeration is a different one. That's the satisfaction truth theory, not the truth.
Yeah,
theory.
satisfying. Yeah, it's a property of propositions, but it's going to be
right, just like truth is. It's just truths. It's an analysis of truth.
Right, but
according to whatever grand theory.
Yeah.
So
But it's going to be different for each one, right? Because it's just going to be for pig fly. The proposition that donkey satisfies X if donkey.
Yeah, I don't. yeah, I'm not, yeah, it's not clear to me, because what he says after the, after the listing, he says, in this way, the deflationary conception and the grand theory coexist peacefully. But by taking them together, we find that the grand theory was not, after all, a theory about truth. It was a theory of many things. It was a theory of the talking of a donkey and the flying of pigs and the purring of cats and much else.
Right.
It told us that all of the talking of a donkey and the flying of pigs and the purring of cats and ... were all of them matters of correspondence to facts. I mean, or were all of them matters of coherence of a total theory, or, and so on, right? Depending on what the grand theory is. And he says that at the end, he says, when the grand theory was stated in terms of truth, that was just a way of abbreviating its multitude of claims by one concise slogan. I mean, look, I guess this is perhaps a way of thinking about how one would combine or hybridize grand theories with deflationary theories. I just think that most of the people who propose the grand theories would reject that way of hybridizing it.
Why?
Well, because they think that they're giving theories that are, after all, about truth. Whereas Lewis is here saying that it is not, after all, about truth.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm not sure what
that's-
I'm not sure
that's
how much
me.
hangs on this, or if it's just him trying to make a neener point about you think you've identified what truth is when you say correspondence to the facts, but really what you're saying is, if I'm wearing my glasses today corresponds to the facts, then that's something about I'm wearing my glasses today. No, you're
So I'm not sure how to make
But
sense
that's
exactly of what he
proposition,
says, but I
right?
think
I mean,
it's
isn't
exactly
it?
what Karen is saying. The sentiment of his argument is exactly what Karen is saying. It's saying, I don't
Somehow
think
the
you've
talking of a donkey corresponds to the fact. Well,
no. It's
So,
before
why
that.
why does talking donkeys satisfy the condition? Why does a pig flying satisfy the condition? Why does cat purring satisfy the condition? So all your
it doesn't. It's the proposition that satisfies the condition. Right? It's the proposition that whatever satisfies the condition.
right.
But it's the proposition, right? I mean, taken as a proposition that satisfies the condition.
yes.
So now if you take Lewis's view, perhaps the proposition just is the talking of the donkeys in all of the worlds in which donkeys talk, or something like that, right? And maybe that's what's in the background of this line of reasoning. Now that I'm thinking about it, right? Because what for him is a proposition, but a set of worlds in which exactly the thing that the proposition says is actually does happen, right? So
I think you're right, Kenny. Okay, so
yeah,
it's
okay.
the
That's
first.
what's going on here.
let me put it in my words and see if it agrees.
Yeah,
with you.
please,
So,
please.
Because I think Karen is right too. It's just that Karen is talking about 102 and you're talking about 103. So basically, what he's saying is,
yes.
if
Okay.
you do the enumerations according to the sample of 102, all you have is not yet a theory, but a sample that you can iterate on and continue. But notice that you're only talking about the various objects of the world, right? But if you restate this as Tarski did in terms of satisfaction, although actually that's not quite right because it's not open sentences here, it's a different kind of satisfaction. Never mind that. But if you restate it as he lists it on 103, so that you say, okay, there's got to be something, maybe it's correspondence, maybe coherence, whatever it is, that fits into the X, then any theory about what that X would be can stand in for the enumeration, and now we actually have a theory without an ellipsis. But then you have to provide the X. Section 2. To my mind, the most promising way to fit the X is, and then he goes on.
Okay.
Right. But then he goes on and saying, but look, you are plugging the X in a list again. So I still think this is not really a theory about truth. It's about the list.
You'll never get rid of the list because those have to be the corollaries of the theory. But as long as the theory is not itself the list, you've actually done something. And what he's suggesting, I think, is that the truthmaker principle might lead us out of that.
No, because
Well, you've done something. You've done a lot. You've told us about an infinite number of things.
he still
Well,
says in
all
105.
generalizations are about an infinite number of things.
Yeah.
He's not saying we never have theories.
These theories are just not about truth, he still says on.
Yeah, even on 105, up in the truth principle, he says it still exists. The
Yeah,
deflationary
no,
account.
right.
So-
But that's just because it's not going to be about it's because it's going to be a theory about truth makers, not truth. But it's still going to give us what we wanted from a theory of truth. It'll just require us to talk about truth makers and propositions and leave truth out. It's he's just being, specific. But it's not like he's not. It's not like he's recommend. He's not saying that there's no prospect for a theory of truth makers. The whole point of the paper is to explore how we can do that.
Well, there's an interesting question though, really, as to whether or not, you know, how much of his motivation is actually to just replace ultimately the truth-making principle with some sort of difference-making principle.
that one, that's the project right there.
Yeah, sure. But
Right. That is, in other words, it's a way of deflating the truth-making principle, right? Like
yes,
the difference-making principle is the deflated version of the
Right.
truth-making principle.
but it
I
serves
think,
the
yeah.
same function. It's what we wanted from truth. I mean, it might just be that his answer is, you want a theory of truth? I can't give you that for all the usual reasons. Let me remind you. But how about this difference-making principle in terms of propositions and worlds? This might be what you wanted. No, it was for me. I mean, it works for me. I don't particularly. I mean, I think we can still have truth makers. You just have to answer all the various problems that he raises that he's not so optimistic about. But if he just wants to take me down a different path that can advance to a certain extent by way of his arguments, then I think he's on topic. It's just that he's careful about
it's on topic. Yeah.
the topic being truth and truth makers.
Yeah, yes, but I don't think it's what we wanted, or it wasn't what I wanted.
What
I don't want
did-
it to be true that there are no unicorns, because there's a possible world in which there's a unicorn, and that makes it, that's the difference maker that makes the negation true. That's not.
Well,
That's a satisfying
let's get to that.
fiction.
Yeah, let's get to that first. I happen to find that somewhat satisfying.
Oh, interesting.
But it's because I find it satisfying that I find myself satisfied with respect to what I want from truth and truth makers. So, not that I don't
I
have
also think it's
problems
false that there are no impossible unicorns, but we won't get into that anyway. Or that there are impossible unicorns. Yeah.
Onwards,
False that there
unicorn
are-
haters.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
It's
So
false
let-
that there are impossible unicorns.
Let's quickly review the 4 preliminary comments in case it matters. This is immediately after introducing the truth maker principle. What do we get with this principle? We've seen these in the other papers, but yeah, let's spell it out according
Right.
to
Well,
Lewis.
should we say it? Yeah. We should say the truth maker principle before we give 4
Yeah.
comments.
Yeah. Every truth has a truth maker. Spelled out, it's for any true proposition, there exists such that its existence strictly implies the proposition. Yeah. Okay, so preliminary, it's a
I do want to draw attention to one thing at the beginning of 2, but just before going on, just because it's at the very beginning. Because what he does try to say is what he's sympathetic with from the grand theories, right? And he says, to my mind, the most promising, if not the most prominent, among the grand theories of truth are theories that somehow require what's true to depend on the way the world of existing things is, or on the way some part of the world is. So I think if you pay really close attention to it, to what he's saying there is, he's down with the theories that require what's true to depend on the way the world is. So I guess it's, that's how, you
Right. Well,
you can kind of see that these are the propositions, and these propositions just are these these amalgamations of entities across worlds, right? So it's that it points the way for the deflation, for the deflationary move, if you focus in on that. What were you going to say, Josh?
No, I was just going to say sympathetic because instead of, the way the world is, he's going to be the way the worlds are in these, tuple relationships, right? For difference making. So he sees
Yeah.
this because he's going to depend on that for his analysis. He's just going to extend it to difference making. So yeah, obviously sees that as a strength. But I think, at least for me intuitively, the way the world is should be sufficient for determining the truthfulness of a proposition, not the way possible worlds are across, and matching that up in the
Yeah.
pairs. There's just nothing, I don't want to say intuitive, just nothing satisfying about it.
I wasn't even sure that possible worlds helped explain the truth of propositions that were explicitly about possibility. And so it's not necessarily going to help me explain propositions that are not about possibility but about actuality. So yeah, I don't know. Anyway, but we'll move on.
All right.
Okay, so the first one
is
that it's unnecessary. And it's interesting, actually. The very truth-maker principle is already modal. So you had better have some idea of what you're going to
because
do
of
modality.
T's existence strictly implies or necessitates P.
Yeah, and the truth,
right?
the truth. Can I just say that? I mean, he starts at the top of the page, bottom of the previous one, with the most promising of the grand theories of truth are the theories that somehow require what's true to depend on the way the world of existing things is, or the way some part of the world is. And the truth maker principle is very different from that already, right?
Is it?
Because for any proposition P, there exists something T such that T's existence strictly implies P. Whereas what about the way T is? Not just its existence. So, I mean, it's got to be, for this to be intuitive, T has got to either include things like states of the affairs, right? So let's see.
Well, this is why properties and relations are going to come up, right?
Right. So I bought a visual aid. I couldn't find a cat, so I've got a bear on a mat, right? So here's a proposition: the bear is on the mat, and so there's got to be a thing whose existence strictly implies that the bear is on the mat is true. But is it the bear? No, because his existence doesn't strictly imply the bear is on the mat. So is it the mat bear? What's a mat bear when it's at Brands?
This was the objection that I raised when we were reading when we were talking about oh man, I've already forgotten her name, the woman who swam the English Channel.
Whatever. Oh yeah. Oh god, I better look it up. Constance, I know what it was. Yeah.
And I was saying, well, if she hadn't, then she'd still exist.
Right.
But she wouldn't be making it true.
Right. And so so the thing, and what's making it true that the bear is on the mat
clearly
is the bear's being on the mat, right? It's not existence.
Right.
Some other bear could be on the mat. Like it's so, this is very sort of specific, and its necessitation seems harsh, or seems kind of like,
you need it.
I guess
there is a possible world at which the counterpart to that bear is a cat, and that would make work.
Sure.
I mean, I guess I'd say if you put this thing in any world, you put the bears on the mat in it, maybe, right? So yeah, but anyway, but so this I think is going beyond the intuitive of the way the world of existing things and the way they are is what makes things true. There's something.
Well, that's something
necessitates, its very existence necessitates.
Right, but that something could be the relation, right? Of the bear being on the mat. The existence of that relation would make true. And I think
state of affairs, right? Yeah.
It has to
be. Yeah.
It has to be either a state of affairs as an existent, or it has to be something with tropes.
Right. And just, you got to be careful though, because you don't want to then make, get too quickly into if and only ifs, right? Because the bear could move slightly, new different relationship, but we do slip quite quickly into if and only ifs. So anyway.
Yeah, no, it's definitely the concern at the end of the paper.
Yeah. Okay. Bears rarely stay still on maths. Okay.
So the second principle is that it's got to be more than accidentally correct. It's got to work counterfactually. So straight into modality, here it is. I had no problem with that. I have been anticipating us having to deal with modality all along, and I like the way he did so here. No?
Yeah, he says if a proposition P is contingently false, then if P were true, it would have a truth maker.
Right. So there's definitely truth
Yeah.
makers at other possible worlds. And that has something to do with P's being possibly true, even if it's false, right? Very intuitive. And third,
Well, it's
what's that? What's that? Okay. Third,
the
about
third is actually like
sentences
in
and
the same paragraph as the
propositions.
second.
Yeah,
Right.
no,
It's that it applies derivatively to
Oh, to sentences and thought.
sentences and thoughts. Right. So if I'm
think-
thinking the bear's on the mat, then
does this come up again in the
There's-
paper? It seems like something he just had to say to move to propositions, but otherwise lets it go. Yes, no.
I guess it's just a way of understanding the relationships between truth makers, propositions, sentences, and natural languages, and thoughts and in heads, right?
The bit about sentences that he gives.
Yeah.
I thought it
don't
was
think
very
makes much of
clever.
it.
What he's saying is that there is a proposition that's expressed by the sentence, but then there's another proposition which, there's another proposition which characterizes the expressive power of the sentence, and by relating it to the proposition which it expresses.
Oh, right. Because there's a
After all, after all, if we're trying to sorry, what were you gonna say, Karen?
Yeah, because you've got it. Okay, so propositions like are connected to states of affairs or things, and then natural languages, they're connected to propositions which are connected to things. But there are also, but there's also that truth that collection of sounds or word letters on a page is connected to that particular proposition. So there's another relationship of true.
Yeah, so it has to both be true that the sentence expresses that proposition,
Yeah,
and that proposition is true.
right. So the English sentence, the bear is on the mat, expresses the proposition, the bear is on the mat, and the bear is on the mat. So there's two truths there, or there's two truth makers. I guess there's the proposition serves as a truth maker. Wait, does the proposition serve as a truth maker for the claim that the English sentence means the bear is on the mat? Or is it like the history of the language that makes that true?
Yeah, or is it the
I guess it's the convention. It's what he says,
Conventions
right?
of the language,
The semantic conventions of Latin.
So you need you need a truth maker to make that connection between the sounds and the proposition.
Yeah.
Okay. And
Same thing with thoughts. You need whatever it is that connects thoughts to propositions, functional roles or whatever.
right.
This is actually,
Functional roles.
yeah,
For thoughts, he throws functional roles out as a possible. So it is the conventions of Latin that makes the Latin sentence mean the proposition the bear is on the mat. It's some sort of functional role which makes this firing of neurons in my head mean the bear is on the mat.
Mhm.
And so there's got to be some so the functional role is the truth maker for the claim that my thoughts about the bear is on the mat, and then that proposition is made true by the bear being on the mat.
That's quite clever.
Yeah. So double your truth, double your what was it, double mint gum commercial? Double your pleasure.
No,
double
I
your
think,
propositions, double.
Double your truth makers.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So for a sentence to be true, it has to be true that means a certain proposition, and then the
Has
proposition
to
itself
mean
has to be
something,
true.
and then
That's
that,
two
yeah.
different truth makers. Yeah, straightforward. Okay. And then the fourth is long, and it's where he sets out his commitments regarding possible worlds, but also the commitments that he requests from us as readers, which is not the same. It begins by saying that if we take his particular view of possible worlds, then his cat would be the truth maker for every truth proposition, because of course it's not in any other world. And he says, but that's not really what we're going to say. We're going to rely on counterparts. But if you have some other theory of possible worlds, then just, use your theory. But the point is you can
Right,
have some account of possible worlds, and it's going to have to be relevant.
Right, because it's a problem if it says, when we say that T's existence strictly implies P, what we mean is anytime you put this bear mat in a world, you've got the bears on the mat being true. Because you can't put this bear mat in any other world on his account. You can just have worlds where there's a bear mat counterpart. So he's just sort of clarifying how he's going to have to tinker.
But I think there's just two important points here. One is that he's excusing himself from the obvious failure if we take counterparts not to be a form of identity. But he's also asking us to remember that you don't have to sign up to his modal realism to follow the rest of the argument. And he even has a reference to another paper in which he tells us how much more he can say about truth makers if you do employ modal realism, his modal realism, or as he calls it, his concretism somewhere. I liked that term better. He says at the end, so mean what you like by exist in a world, provided you have something in mind which does not automatically rule out that an actually existing thing, say my cat possum, should exist in an unactualized world. So,
right.
Yeah.
The truth maker principle needs to apply counterfactually, not only about the truths of our world, but the truths of all possible worlds, whatever they are.
Right. So he wants to try to give an argument which is general and neutral enough, whether you take worlds and their inhabitants to be concrete or abstract, real or fictitious.
So then he ends up with a world relative truth principle, TM on 106. For any proposition P in any world W, if P is true in W, then there exists something T in world W, such that for any other world, V, if T exists in V, then P is true in V.
Right. Yeah, I think what this does is put an asterisk with exists throughout the rest of the paper, because it can't be exists as in is actual, right? Because he says the only thing I want out of this word exists is that it's got to work such that I can say that, this very bear exists in a non-actual possible world.
Yeah, like
and
you
so
said, mean what you like by exist in a world.
Right.
So the asterisk was actually explicit on 105.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
But for a lot of people, their intuitions about truth making they're just gonna pull away from that kind of notion of existence just at the get-go.
Can we talk about that? I don't understand what the problem is.
If you're trying to say something like, to say the bears on the mat is true is to say something exists, right?
No, it's to say something exists in a world.
It's to say there's something exists that making it true, right? Don't talk world, just talk. There's something that exists that
talk
makes
normal.
That was the
okay, all right.
Yeah, talk normal. Yeah, talk normal. It means there's something that exists. There's some bear on some mat, right? now, okay, so there's something that exists, like here now, bear mat, right? It's
mhm.
true. And now you're saying, okay, but can you just take that word exists when you're waving around a bear and a mat in your actual hand and talk about it such that that is not ruling out it being in some possible world, right? You're like, wait, what are you talking about possible worlds? It's really important to me that I'm saying it's true because it's this bear and this mat here now. Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Maybe
we
this
are
is
part
a
of a
necessary bear to this actual world.
yeah.
It cannot exist anywhere else, right? I don't know. Yeah.
I mean,
Is
we are
it
part of
perfectly
it.
true that the bear is one mat?
Sure. I mean, those intuitions are important, but at the same time, it's also important that we're part of a tradition that has tried to address modality, truth modality, possibility, necessity, by employing possible world talk. Possible world talk has been accepted by very many as being metaphysically neutral. It's just a logical system which postpones questions about what it is that they are all about. And there are a number of different takes on what it might all be about. But maybe I'm naive, but I don't know of a way around possible world talk. Of course, you can just choose not to talk about necessity and possibility. But assuming you want to have anything to say about the validity of arguments that employ necessity and possibility with any sophistication beyond a reduction of them to some kind of analyticity or logical truth, then you have to talk about possible worlds. You don't have to think possible worlds are concrete or that they're abstract or that they are in any way in contest with what exists in this world, but you have to be able to talk about it.
Right. Then how about this?
Well,
maybe my intuition here is that, yeah, so David Lewis has given us this talk of existence and possibility and possible world. It's all very, very helpful. But on that, he also gave this concept of actuality. And to capture my initial intuitions about truth making, the statements on 105, which currently read, if a donkey talks, then there exists something T such that T's existence strictly implies that a donkey talks. Intuitively, I would say, no, it should say, if a donkey talks, then there actually is. That something is actual, then T is actual. And T's actuality makes, if a donkey talk, makes,
yeah, sure.
implies that a donkey
Yeah,
talks,
no,
right?
that's good. That's good. I would be okay with
So
doing that
I
as
would
long as you
build
put
in-
actuality on both sides of the biconditional. It's actually true if the truth maker actually exists. It's
Right,
possibly
yeah,
true
there's-
if it possibly exists,
Wait, why both sides?
because otherwise you're
So it is true because it is actualized. I mean, that's what makes it true. So why would you want it on both sides of the biconditional? I don't understand.
I'm sorry, it's true because it's actualized, you said?
Yes. It's the actuality of the thing that makes it true. So why would you want the actual
No,
on both?
it's not the actuality that makes it true. It's its existence at the world at which the proposition is true that makes it true. I'm not even sure actualization as a verb makes any sense. I don't understand what it means. And Lewis does use it. You know, I highlighted that. I don't understand what he meant by it. When we get to the where does he say it? The principle of distinctive occupants, he starts to lose me, although I have an idea of how to interpret it, but it worried me because I don't know what actualization as a verb really means. In the Lewisian theory of actuality is an index, and to actualize makes as little sense as to herify or nullify. Of course, I use the term, but I use it in the context of actuality is introduced by Aristotle, which has more to do with potentials than possibilities. That's to mix modality with time, or rather, alethic with temporal modality. But here we're not doing time; we're just doing alethic. So you don't actualize anything. The actual world is just the one you're in, and you're not doing anything to make it the actual world.
No, but an actualized possibility is just a possibility that is indexed to this world, right? It is something that is actualized. You're not making it happen. It just is the case that it's the possibility is
Yeah, I guess I
one that
just,
exists in the world.
I
So it's
mean,
indexed. Yeah. actualized and that it's a possibility that really is the case, and that's what makes something true.
My problem with it is not the root actual, but with its use as a verb. So if I just treat everything you said by taking actualized as synonymous with actual, then I agree. But I don't know what's added by speaking of actualization as a process of any kind or a verb. Nothing's changing.
It's like a state of affairs, I guess. I mean, I guess it seems like to me that all of Lewis's philosophy is driven, or possible world realism is driven by the claim at the bottom that he gets to quite naturally from what he's saying here, that otherworldly truths have their otherworldly truth makers. And
but that's nothing to do with modal realism. Do you just
I
not accept
think it is.
that you can?
No, let me talk about it. Let me talk about it. So, it's something to say, like, you come up with some philosophy where you have to say, you know, it's possible that there could be unicorns means that there's some world in which there is unicorns is true, meaning, and then meaning you have to have a non-existent unicorn, a non-actual unicorn existing somewhere, right? Because otherworldly truths need their truth makers. Whereas you could say, no, that's the whole point of it being not our world truth. It just isn't true. Unicorns don't need truth makers.
Well, unicorns
They
aren't
don't exist.
propositions.
Yeah, there is.
That's why they don't need. No.
Right.
The reason they don't need truth makers is because they're not propositions.
Statements about statements about
but those do.
Don't need truth makers.
The sentence "there are no unicorns" does need a truth maker.
They don't need another worldly truth maker. Their truth maker is this world, this unicorn-free world.
Perhaps, but the statement "there might have been unicorns" does need a truth maker, and I don't think you're going to find it in the actual world.
Sure you are.
Unless
all that genetic stuff he talks about it.
Unless your theory of possible worlds is such that possible worlds are parts of the actual world. But he's neutral on that point. So do you just not accept his peace pipe of neutrality on the metaphysics of possible worlds?
The question is whether or not, when he uses phrases like otherworldly truths have their otherworldly truth makers, how to interpret that in a way which is neutral.
I think there is a clear neutral way to interpret it. Namely, other worlds are just worlds other than the actual world, whatever they are.
I'm not sure if there's a neutral way to interpret that. If you just use possible world talk as like that.
No, I didn't say there's a neutral way to interpret what I said. What I gave you is the neutral interpretation, which itself cannot be interpreted in a neutral way. But the point is, you can interpret it any way, which way you want, and you don't have to interpret it for the remainder of this paper to make sense. All you have to interpret is otherworldly as meaning non-actual possible world. How you interpret non-actual possible world is open, and you can't interpret it without making further commitments, but you don't need to interpret it to understand the rest of the argument. Yeah, the way he presented modal realism never worked. I think there's a better way to do it without disagreeing with Lewis. But it's his choice. Okay. So, I mean, I'm not sure what to do with the rest of the paper if we can't get into a neutral position with respect to the metaphysics of possible worlds. Either, I mean, the rest of the paper just makes no progress whatsoever otherwise. I'm not sure what you want to do.
No, I mean, just give an example. So in other words, it might be that the other worlds are abstract entities of some kind, that otherworldly truths are truths which are true, in those worlds, and the truth makers are certain, like, abstract parts of those abstract worlds or something. If you have you could, like, the way that Plantinga would think about this, he thinks about, he has the reverse strategy, right? He thinks about worlds in terms of propositions as opposed to thinking about propositions in terms of worlds. right?
Right.
So he would just think that the otherworldly truths are certain propositions which have certain like abstract parts which are the would-be truth makers, but which aren't actualized or instantiated, and that's why they're otherworldly truth makers. So like there is I think there is a way to read it. It just the wording of it suggests a different way. Maybe it might feel more natural to read it in a more
That's just
realistic
because
way
we
or
know what he
something.
thinks.
Yeah, well, that's also
Strictly
true too, right?
speaking,
Because we
in the
also know what he
language
thinks.
he's using.
But I do think you can interpret it in some of the other frameworks as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's read it again, right? So for any proposition P in any world W, here W can be a class of propositions. It can be a recombination of parts of the actual world. It can be a fiction, but it's got to be something. And there has to be some sense in which we understand what it is for P to be true in W. So one world might be the world of Harry Potter, right? We don't have to talk about whether it's concrete or abstract or a fiction or whatever. But there is something to be true at the world of Harry Potter. And so TM then is that it would mean that there exists something T in the world W. Well, what is it for there to exist, for something to exist in the world of Harry Potter? Well, if you take a fictionalist account, presumably it would be that J.K. Rowling says so. Says that it exists, right?
Yeah, sure.
It could be that T is the proposition P.
I mean, yeah, depending on your theory, I guess the proposition
Right.
can make itself true is what you're saying. Yeah,
I don't.
Well, look,
so.
if for any proposition, if worlds were if worlds were sets of propositions, then for any proposition P in any world W, P is true in W if P is one of those propositions, right? So if P is so there exists T, something T in the world. I mean, so let's just say,
yeah, sure.
Right, if we just thought the world of Harry Potter was the sentences in the Harry Potter books, then there's on one page it says Harry waved his wand and said luminous or something or whatever. So did Harry wave his wand and say luminous? Is that true? Well, you look for the proposition. I mean, you look for it's in the list. It's in the list. So it's that for any word. And if you put that proposition in any other book, it would make it true in that world.
Right? Yeah, but that's not what it means to say.
Around.
Mm-hmm. But then you're changing TM to trivial tautology.
That's what Armstrong's, I think, problem was with using worlds.
On your reading, yes, but not on the reading that we proposed. So if the proposition is Hermione exists, okay, the truth maker is Hermione, and we say that Hermione exists in the world of Harry Potter, not because Hermione is a proposition. She is not a proposition. The proposition Hermione exists is a proposition, but she is not a proposition. The point is that she exists in that world. Now, what it is for her to exist at that world will have to be reducible to something having to do with whatever worlds are. And if worlds are classes of propositions, there's got to be some relationship between the two. But it can't just be any proposition because she's not a proposition. It's just taking possible world talk seriously. Otherwise, you're just trivializing this to a tautology.
Well, that would just be one reading of what a world is. I mean, in fact, it's just what it would be to do would be to read it in the, like, as in the idea of a world as a Kripke model or whatever, right? I mean, that would be literally the way to write this as a kind of statement of mathematical logic.
It would just be it would be unexpected for an interpretation of possible worlds to make it that possible people are existential propositions. I don't know how far that's going to get. But I don't think we even need to talk about it, because we could just be neutral in the metaphysics of possible worlds. We can just understand that when we say that something exists, we're not talking about the saying that something exists. We're talking about what exists. And that's true when we're talking about the actual world.
Right.
Why shouldn't it be? Why should it be any different when we're talking about non-actual worlds? There has to be some neutral way of speaking about worlds, because you don't know which one the actual one is.
I guess I was taking the recommendation for neutrality as an invitation to take some of the candidates that he was giving and see how they would read TM.
Yeah.
And some of the candidates, if you see worlds as just sets of propositions, then the T that makes P be a part of that set of top propositions is going to be P.
No, because if the world is a set of propositions, that doesn't mean that to exist at a world is to be a member of that set.
Well,
Okay, what does it mean?
There's a further question as to what it means to exist in a world,
which is the metaphysical question we can avoid, but we don't have it in the neutral theory, that is the theory that abstains from making metaphysical claims about possible worlds, that is what it means to exist at a world. What it is to exist at a world is, as he says, it can mean whatever you want it to mean, but it can't be something that would contradict the part of the theory that is shared by all the different metaphysical readings. And to identify objects at a world with propositions that are true about the objects at a world doesn't strike me as so much an interpretation as a contradiction with what is generally true of all the interpretations of the metaphysics of possible worlds. It's just going to make the rest of the theory fall apart, and the rest of the paper as well. But I mean, if that's the best we can do, then I don't know. I don't know which farther we get. This is the same problem we had last week, actually.
Okay, so I'm not sure I see the similarity.
I think so, because we don't you remember one of the sticking points in the interpretation of the entailment principle was whether truth makers were existential propositions, or what the existential proposition of entails exists.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't make a distinction between the two, then yeah.
No,
is just to be a member of the set of propositions that.
But you're taking the opposite side this week, because Joshua and I were saying that the paper,
I guess.
We were saying that this entailment relationship holds between objects and propositions, and you were saying that only propositions could entail other propositions.
Yes.
So it was
no, but that doesn't mean I'm taking.
There wasn't an entailment relationship between any objects and any propositions, except maybe between the specific proposition, a wooden bear exists, and this thing.
Yeah, no, I don't think I'm taking a view opposite from the one I took last week. I'm saying the same thing as I said last week. I'm saying entailments are always between propositions, and truth makers aren't propositions. Truth makers are the objects that are true, that exist if the existential propositions are true.
Well, if that's, I mean, look, I'm not actually sure that what it may be that the interpretation that Karen assigned to TM that she's exploring has there may be other reasons why it's not well motivated. But as an interpretation of TM, I'm not actually sure that it's like invalid or anything. It's just that if you want TM to require that the T not be a proposition, then we would have to, add an extra condition or something.
I mean, we would have to conclude
Presume-
that worlds contain, that the only things that exist at worlds are propositions.
Right.
Does that seem like it's going to go far? I mean, we can see how far it goes, but is that even something you believe?
Yeah, sure.
Do you believe that the
de-
only
depend-
non-actual possibility is that the world consisted exclusively of propositions?
if with the only, it doesn't say there's only a non-actual, what? The TM principle
Uh,
doesn't say anything
we take-
about.
No, it doesn't. That's my point. If you interpret it as saying that truth makers
Right.
are propositions, then it would follow that although the actual world
No,
has,
we're not. It's not. It's not. The interpretation doesn't require that propositions are the only things that could make something true, but it does leave open the possibility of reading it as a candidate, right?
well, of course, some propositions are made true by propositions, namely propositions about propositions.
Sure. Yeah.
But that's not going to work for the other propositions. I mean, I, I mean, let's run with it. It's fine. So then, what do we end up with? We end up with the difference principle, right? That's what's next.
That's what
The difference making
DM is.
principle,
Yeah.
DM, yeah. So
Yeah.
we just skip mentions of truth and of truth makers, and just say that the difference between worlds is about
Something that's
population.
in one but not in the other.
Population differences.
Right. Yeah.
Because if there was nothing, I mean, and this follows from the truth maker principle, right? Because if there was presumably if there was no truth, if there was no difference in the truths assigned to world A and world B, world A and world B would presumably be the same world. So the only way you have a difference between A and B is that there's something that's true in A that's not true in B. And then you have the truth maker principle that says there's a proposition that's true in A and not true in B, means there's a truth maker in A that isn't in B. So every world's got to have something in it that's not in any other world. Otherwise, it's not a distinct world. And that follows from the fact that you need truth makers to have truths. Right.
Additionally, and this is where it started to get tricky for me, it has to be a two-way difference in population.
Well, in this section of the paper.
Yeah. At this section of the paper. Yeah.
Right.
Because you immediately think, well, you could just take something out. You don't need to put something else in, right? And at the end, I mean, he'll say, yeah, oh, we could have just contracting worlds.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, the world that is this entire universe except exact without my toothbrush is a possible world, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But everything in that world is in this world. So there isn't something that's in that world that isn't in this world. Unless you say the sad absence of a toothbrush is a something, which is possible, I guess. Right.
So what did you make of the principle of distinctive occupants? This turns on actualization. He says,
right.
Where is it?
By applying the truth maker principle to the proposition that world W is actualized,
There it is.
we derive this principle of distinct occupants. So the proposition that world W is actualized. So already this is something.
I mean, I had a trivial reading of this. I don't know why it's wrong.
I'm not sure what to think about. I'm not really sure what to think about when it comes to propositions, of this sort, right? Where like of a certain world. being actual or being possible, or
Yeah, I wrote, when he gave the proof, I kind of wrote beside it, none of this makes sense! Exclamation point. Except, unless it's this kind of problem that it's kind of like the related problem of how everything is entailed by necessary truth, or everything entails necessary truth, right? So if you take the proof of the, so I mean, first of all, it kind of intuitively follows, right? So if a world is only, if world A is only not world B because there's something true in A that's not true in B, otherwise they'd be the same world. And this means that since truths need a truth maker, there must be something in A making that thing true that's not in B, because if it was in B, it would make the thing true and they'd be the same world again, right? And then you say it goes back the other way, so there must be something in B, right, that makes it not A, right? Because if it was an A, then they would all have the same truth, and they'd be, so now every world has something, distinct in it, right, whose existence makes it that world and not any other world, right? So
But
but
why
then he
can't
sort
that
of
just be the
plugs
whole
things,
world?
right? It could be. I thought that the biggest candidate in some of these things is the world itself, right? But
Right.
well, no, because arguably the world itself is not a thing.
Sure it is.
But
At least
anyway,
in Lewis it is. It's the mereological fusion of all of
well,
those.
right, but I guess the issue is whether or not this is a neutral way of speaking. I don't know. The W is
well,
actualized. I don't know.
I mean,
I mean,
because
I
wait,
just don't-
let's say so the only difference between world A and B is Boris the bear is in A and not in B.
Mhm.
Then you're going to say, well, it's the mereological fusion of all the things in A. But the mereological fusion of all the things in A and the mereological fusion of all the things in B, and really the only difference is Boris. You might as well say Boris. So otherwise you don't need a difference maker. A is A and B is B, and that's the difference. They're different. They're identical but numerically distinct mereological fusions, because they're counterparts, right? So they're not the same. So yeah, you don't need a difference maker. You just need a you don't need a difference maker that shows up in the realm of truth, presumably, I guess. Except maybe the world A is not world B, and that's it. And they just
I think the reason we shouldn't be speaking of other worlds as counterparts of any one world when talking about the truth maker of the sentence, the world W is actualized, is because we're using the possible world's idiom when we use the when we say the world is actualized. And when you use the possible world's idioms, then you can't rely on counterparts as identicals. It's only when you speak subjunctively that you can. But then if you were speaking subjunctively, you wouldn't be speaking about the world at all as being actualized. So I think, given that I learned how to speak this way from Lewis, I'm reluctant to call this out as the trouble, but that's what I thought.
okay. But let's
Yeah, because
plug this
if W is a non-actual world, then the proposition that W is actualized is false. It doesn't have a truth maker because it's not true. So,
but it does have a possible truth maker, namely itself, and that's what makes it true were W actual.
that's what would make it true if it were actual, but it isn't actual, and the proposition is that it is actual.
Okay, let's say
yeah.
Let's say
So,
we have. I mean, let's just run through this proof to see why I was starting to pull my hair out at this point in this paper. Okay, so we have. Let's make this is T. This is the T that exists in. There's a world W, and Boris the bear is the T that exists in that world and no other world. So it's the world. It's what makes W W, right? He's the distinctive occupant. Is Boris. Okay, so we take any, and otherwise it's the same as our world. what is our world, because I've got the words right here. So for any proposition P, honey is sweet, and any world, so it's our world, the world in which we live right now. If honey is sweet is true in the world in which we live right now, and T is a distinctive occupant of the world in which we live right now, then Boris the bear is a thing whose existence strictly implies that honey is sweet. Now that I guess that's kind of true, right? Because if Boris the bear is only in this world, and this is a world where honey is sweet, then you know that if Boris the bear is there, honey is sweet is true, because you know which world you're in.
Okay, I misread this because I was fixated on thinking of the distinctive occupant as the whole world, which actually connects to how I'm going to interpret this now. I think this is the slingshot argument again.
Yeah, it seems like it's one of those
Oh,
things.
really?
Everything is in time. So I'm like, this is
because
crazy.
you're
Like,
showing
what's
that
the point of all this?
you're showing that every truth maker makes every other truth true.
Well, every distinctive truth maker
Yeah,
but
every
any given
distinctive truth
world
maker will make every
will
truth
make
true.
everything true that's
Sure.
true in that happens to be true in that world.
Yeah.
Yeah, which makes
Which-
distinctive truth makers all powerful. Go Boris.
Right.
well, it's not clear that you
Like
can be
or
a
crazy.
distinctive
Yeah, I don't know.
occupant without being the whole world. So I'm not sure it's such a terrible thing.
So if it is the whole world, then you're saying
Then that would
something
make
like
then that would make sense, because the whole
every
world should
proposition
make
is made
true
true
all
by
of
the
the
world.
truths of that world. Right.
Right. Yeah.
That
Which-
would make sense.
Right. That's why I read this and I thought, yeah.
So
what?
then DO is for any world W, the world exists only in itself. Okay.
Yeah, sure. Right. And in no other.
And
Yeah.
then no other. Yeah, I guess that's how worlds are supposed to work.
Right.
That's yes. Well,
Yeah. So anyway,
but let's
let's go on because I got
So
25
he-
minutes.
yeah. So he says,
But those aren't the truth makers we're
I mean-
interested in, right? Because we want something relevant, which is why he falls back on plurality of truth makers.
yeah. Right. So what's interesting is he sort of, forms these circles of implications, right? So actually this special case is supposed to entail the general case. DO is supposed to imply TM. He gives little proof. And then, and then he says, whether we have the implication from DM back to TM is a more difficult question, but then he shifts to the plural versions because they're a little bit clearer as to how the arguments work. So now he has TMP, which is just the truth-making principle with a plurality of things that make the proposition true together, right? So he calls this the plural truth maker principle. It says that the T's collectively make P true. All right, so
Where are you reading?
I'm sorry, I'm looking at 108 now. I mean, unless you want to go through any of the proofs.
No, I'm on 108 too. I think
Yeah, this is another one where it's just like it's crazy. Like, so if you look at the what's MI, the mirological, the principle MI at the very bottom.
Oh, at the bottom.
Yeah.
Before. Yeah.
the mirror
For any
image.
proposition, yeah. So yeah, for any proposition P. So let's take the proposition cats exist in any world W. If cats exist is true in W, there exists some one or more possible things, F1, F2, not in world W, such that for any world V, if none of the F's exists in V, then P is true in V. So what are these things that must not exist in worlds for cats to exist? Anti-cats?
It's just all, I mean, it could be, I don't know, all of the non-cats, I guess.
That's what I thought.
But you can have a world full of non-cats and still have cats. So what are the non-cats that make cats not exist? Right? Okay,
It's
so
it's the
any proposition-
No,
it's a relationship between the. It's a relationship
Right.
between the non-cats and the entire world. It's the extent to which the non-cats are identical with the entire world that you get. You get the truth maker relation.
Oh, again, so again, these are sort of like, if you have a world's worth of non-cats and you squeeze those into any given world, it's going to stop the cats from being there.
Well, I mean, you don't have to make it dynamic, but something like that.
Well, like so for any proposition P, so put in cats exist, and
Yeah.
any world W, so put in our world. If P is true in W, which it is, right? I can find a cat somewhere here. There
Mhm.
exists some one or more possible things not in our world. So I'm candidates of what those are, such that in any world V, the world next door, if none of the F's exists in V, then cats exist in V. So what are these things that would go over into the world next door and prevent cats from existing? Or where if they don't exist, cats can exist?
Yeah, this is a strange principle. It's almost
anti-cats?
like they're preventers or something.
Yeah, they're
Preventers
preventers
of
of
existing.
cats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cat existence preventers. And as things, right, as numerous things that would go into this neighborhood world, this world next door, and prevent cats from existing. And if they're not there, cats automatically exist. You don't even need evolution for it. You need the anti-cats to be absent, and then you're going to get your cats, right? So this is F1 is anti-cat 1, F2 is anti-cat 2. If you go over to V and neither anti-cat 1 or anti-cat 2 is there, you're going to have cats.
Well,
But
first
what
of
kind
all,
of weird thing is anti-cat?
well, hold on a second. MI is not the idea that I was just proposing, and I think Kenny was too. Like the set of not set, but the non-cats. MI is to try to formalize the idea of false makers, right? So if there are no cats at W, that is made true by what would make there are cats false. So it's that the cats at V are not at W. So
Yes, MI is helpful for when the proposition P is a negative existential.
right.
That is true. A true negative existential. So in other words, when it says like there are no F's or whatever, when the proposition is of that form, MI is very useful. But it is true for propositions in general. It says for any proposition. So it's just sort of strange when you look at positive existentials or just claims that are not,
Well, it's just not going to work in the case of, not obviously anyway, in the case of positive existentials, because then you'd have to start using the complements. But if you use the complements, the non-cats, you may as well have avoided using MI in the first place and had a straightforward truth maker relation for the negative existential. So I think it's unclear that it's meant to apply to all propositions, even if it is.
What says for any proposition?
I'm not saying it's false for any. I'm not saying it's ever false. I'm saying it's not intended.
He recognizes that. Like I said, this paper frustrated because he goes on and says, but obviously there's a big problem with what I just said. So, for example, on 110, he's talking about like, suppose we insisted on positing some sort of truth maker for the negative existential truth that there are no unicorns. There would have to be something in a unicorn-free world like ours to replace the missing unicorns. Yeah, these F1s, F2s you were talking about, right? Thereby making a two-way difference between a world without unicorns and a world with them. These unicorn replacements would have to meet two conditions. First, none of them could possibly coexist with a unicorn. They're anti-unicorns, right? Else it would make the negative existential proposition true, even in a world where there was a unicorn. Second, some one of them could not possibly fail to exist in any world where there were no unicorns. So if you have a possible world where there's only one atom, that atom better also be an anti-unicorn, right? So he's this is.
I like his sentence stuff at the top of 111. Call it will. I think it's bad news for systematic metaphysics. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
I mean he's. He doesn't need us. He doesn't need us to tell him the contortions that he's spinning himself into. I mean, he's telling us he's doing so.
Exactly.
Right.
But it's unclear.
So it just made me lose
why
hope.
we're locked
If
into
metaphysics is going
these
to help in truth makers
contortions.
at all.
Well, that's the thing, right? I mean, I think part of why he's going through these contortions is because he wants to say that they reveal that we're going to need something somewhat different.
Yeah.
No, I know.
Yeah, I think
a lot of Lewis's work is, look, this is my
Yeah.
progress so far. If you think it's crazy, you'll realize you'll need something even crazier. There's reasons for having
Right.
gone this far. So it's in
Yeah,
that
and
spirit that I take.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought in the end I liked the paper a little bit better because I thought it's a cautionary tale about the problems you create if you try and cash out truth makers in terms of possible worlds. And so I
Not the
said, yeah, okay,
intention,
lesson
but okay.
learned. Right.
The problem is you're going to need it anyway. I mean, unless you have some other offering for how to understand
I think
truth
truth
maker
makers
theory
drive
from
our right, or what makes it possible for us to talk about possible worlds is our grasp of truth makers
Ooh, I like that.
rather
and
than vice versa.
how would it do that?
Well, so if I recognize that there's like, I can make the bear is on the mat true by doing this, right? Then I can think about possible world in terms of saying, well, I could do this, and then there's no truth maker for that. And so it's an understanding of like situations and how they, in your imagination, they could be otherwise, or it's this, this is the dependence of this and on the truth of the proposition that makes you then be able to, in your mind, disconnect this from reality counterfactually, right?
Still,
so then you can say,
still sort of difference making, but across like time within your one world.
yeah,
right?
within time, play back and forth with making things true and false. It's like near, far with Sesame Street, right? And then you start thinking of, oh, there's a possible world. Well, Elmo never ran near to the camera, or it was Grover in my day, But it's from manipulating through time, truth makers, that you start to think about, well, there could be, anyway.
Can you just briefly explain how we would make sense of there are no unicorns?
Right, because we understand when we say something like, are there any cookies left in the jar? And someone says, no, there's no cookies. And so we understand what there being, something not being there. And then we're told what a unicorn would be if it were to be in the jar, kind of thing. And then we're like, nope, it's not in the jar.
What does it have to do with truth makers?
Because if there's so I say that there's a cookie left in the cookie jar, and you open it up, here's the cookie, makes it true, right? But then at one point, I say there's a cookie left in the cookie jar, and then there's no cookies. So you say, no, that's false. There's no cookies in the cookie jar, right? So you get that idea of what it means for something not to be there. And then, so the story about unicorns tells you what you're looking for.
I'm looking
and
for
then you
anything.
look in the world,
the question
which
is
is
not
the jar,
about how
and it's not there.
The question isn't how
Tells
I
you
learn.
how to identify what you're going to find.
Okay. The question is not about what I learn or what I might do. It's not about me at all. It's about the proposition. The question is, what is the truth maker for that proposition? And it doesn't involve people who understand sentences that express that proposition.
The truth maker for there are no unicorns is the world, yeah.
So it's the same truth maker as for there are horses?
The truth maker for there's no cookies left in the jar is the jar.
Is the same truth maker for both of those?
The truth maker for there are horses is just a horse. It doesn't have to be the whole world.
No, yeah, okay, so there are, not all truth makers are the same, but for there are no cookies in the jar and there are no unicorns and there are no goblins, the truth maker would be the same in all three cases on your account?
Well, the inside of the jar is, I guess, part of the truth maker, for there's no unicorns, but there are no cookies in the jar. The truth maker, but it's for more than that, right? That whereas there's no cookies in the jar, the inside of the jar is the only truth maker you need for that. Whereas,
Okay.
you also need, there are no unicorns, you also need Romania and Zimbabwe, or no, is there Zimbabwe anymore, or whatever. You need Argentina. You need all the places where there's no unicorns.
Okay. So unicorn, being a unicorn doesn't seem to enter into it.
The being.
I mean, I guess there's no such thing as being a unicorn, right? Or something. Is that
Well, there would have to be.
Well, there's a set of criteria for unicornhood, right? I mean, you could say that
are the criteria part of the truth maker?
Are
we back to biconditionals?
Yes, they are actually, right?
So this is not a truth maker theory anymore.
Because the world contains the criteria for unicornness, right? They were created by this this history, and so that's part of what makes it the case that there are no unicorns.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're back to the deflationary theory.
Nothing meets those criteria.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you need anti-unicorns, is what I'm saying. I don't think you need to be able to identify in this world something that is the anti-unicorn that's stopping the unicorns from existing.
Yeah, no,
I think it's just the world is unicornless.
Okay.
It's full of unicorn representations.
You don't have to identify anything in this world, but you would also say that you don't have to identify anything in any other world, right? Or
I mean, that's what's
yeah, you don't have to.
Because that's what.
Because I don't even know how to do that.
Because the MI principle talks about identifying things in other worlds, which is part of what's
right. Yeah, the anti-cats when you yeah. I mean, they might be. It's just I just thought it was super weird. But I think he also recognizes it's weird when he talks about anti-unicorns. Yeah.
All right, where do we want to jump back in?
I just want to read out loud in reference to what we just said. The bottom of 110, he says, suppose we insisted on positing some sort of truth maker for the negative existential truth that there are no unicorns. There would have to be something in a unicorn-free world like ours to replace the missing unicorns, thereby making a two-way difference between a world without unicorns and a world with them. These unicorn replacements would have to meet two conditions. First, none of them could possibly coexist with a unicorn. I guess I'm still not quite understanding why there would have to be unicorn replacements.
Because of MI.
MI doesn't mention replacements. It just says that the unicorn can't exist at the world at which there are no unicorns.
So, but this is after he's introduced DM minus and TM minus.
Also, I think it has to do with it being a two-way difference-making principle.
So what's the difference with these DM minuses and TM minuses? They're the one-way ones, right?
Yeah.
So they're the one-way versions of the same principles.
Mm-hmm.
And then how does he get to 110? Why is he simplest case?
Maybe we should read the paragraph before, right after TM minus.
Yeah, Bigelow's principle, right?
Yeah, this is the one-way difference-making principle. He says this allows truths to have truth makers, but also it allows them to be true just because they lack false makers. The simplest case is that of a negative existential, the proposition that there are no unicorns, say. It is true in the actual world just because there are no unicorns to make it false. in any world where it is false, certain things would have to exist, which in actuality do not exist, namely one or more unicorns. Those otherworldly unicorns are the one-way difference makers between worlds like ours, where the negative existential proposition that there are no unicorns is true, and other worlds where it is false. And in worlds where the negative existential proposition is false, they are the truth makers for its true negation. What more do we need? Two less simple cases. I don't know why we need another case. Okay, so yeah, so I think it's just picking up where I left off before. These unicorn replacements would have to be two. No. Suppose we insisted on positing some sort of truth maker for the negative x. Yeah. Okay. So why would we?
Yeah,
insist on that?
he doesn't say. I guess he's just
He doesn't say it here, but it
raising-
is part of the paper. I think I just missed it. At some point, he explains why it has to go two ways. Like
We
at the
don't.
bottom of 109, he says, why two ways? Certainly one good way for two worlds to differ is for one of them to have something that the other one lacks. But why must it be reciprocal? If we pass from world W to world V by removing something, why must we add something else to take its place? Why not replace it with nothing at all and leave a gap? That is to say, why not rest content with the principle of one-way difference making?
right, and then he introduces those principles.
I think, and then he's on board, right? He says, yeah.
Oh, he is? Oh, okay. Then I misread it. So yeah, but then if he's on board, why is he I see. Okay. Okay. So this first paragraph on 111 is just complaining about what he's rejecting. So okay. So then it's not so bad.
So he says, in the past, I made two different complaints. First, I complained that such a thing seems to be somehow constructed out of simpler things, among them the property of being a unicorn. Yet this cannot be any well understood kind of composition, mereological or even said theoretical, since if it were, the constructed thing would exist if its constituents did, even if unicorns existed as well. Second, I complained that in order to do its job as a truth maker, the unicorn replacement must be involved in necessary connections between mereologically distinct existences. And it is the Humean prohibition of necessary connections that gives us our best handle on the question of what possibilities there are. But now I think that the second complaint subsumes the first, for we can explain how unicorn replacements are constructed out of their constituents, provided we define the quote unquote construction simply in terms of the necessary connections themselves. Then indeed, unmereological composition has been explained, but in a way that does nothing at all towards excusing or explaining the necessary connections.
Actually, I came to this 2 weeks ago myself when I was trying to figure out how to deal with just negations. I wasn't even thinking of negative existentials, but I guess it came to the same thing. I was considering snow is green. Like, why would I take snow is green to be false? And I thought because it has a truth maker at a non-actual possible world that has no counterpart in the actual world. And that seems very similar. And what I wound up having to say then is that instead of affirming the truth maker principle for all truths, I would affirm it only for pairs of truths, where for any given truth and its, for any given proposition, not pairs of truths, pairs of propositions, for any proposition and its negation, either it has a truth maker because it's true, or at the world at which it's false, it would have a truth maker or false maker, something like that. I didn't develop it further because I didn't feel confident about rejecting the truth maker principle, but I wonder if this is what's happening here. Is he rejecting the truth maker principle by saying instead that everything must have either a truth maker or not have a false maker?
I think he is ultimately saying that the truth maker principle, as he introduced it way back, just is really counterintuitive because it requires us to have things that doesn't make any sense. I think like the paragraph on 111, which is where I was like, well, yeah, you just summed up all the problems you've created for yourself. To uphold the truth-maker principle in its original form, we need to say that if there are no unicorns, there must be a unicorn replacement instead, right? Because there's got to be something in this world that makes there are no unicorns true, right? Suppose there were no material objects at all, then likewise, there would have to be a replacement for them, a truth maker for the negative existential proposition that there are no material objects. We could call this thing an absence of material objects, or a negative state of affairs, or a general state of affairs. And again, it would be objectionable because its raison d'etre would require it to be involved in mysterious necessary connections, right? So because of the way the truth maker principle is stated, if you throw an absence of material objects into any universe, right, then this absence of material objects is this thing that you can throw into any universe and make it true that there are no material objects. So, I mean, there's going to be an Avengers movie about this, right? You just find this absence of material objects and you just throw it into any world unless the Avengers stop you. And then there's no material objects because you've got this negative truth maker, negative existential truth maker. If that's a thing, it's this with the necessary properties of making things true or false, then it's this crazy weird thing. So yeah.
So okay, I think I misread this paper, but now as I'm reading it, I like it even more. So at the bottom of section 3, he says, so this is not going to work. So maybe the only way to solve this problem is by reintroducing the metaphysics that he likes about modality, but he had promised not to do that in this paper. And that would be to introduce the false makers at non-actual possible worlds. There are no unicorns is made false by the unicorn in a non-actual possible world. That's what you say. It's not the truth maker principle, but it's close to it.
So should we go to section 4? Or?
Yeah, so Bigelow isn't doing that. Instead, he's just
he's introducing relations as well as things.
Right.
What?
What?
Well, no,
Right,
Bigelow retreats to the one-sided difference making and truth by lack of false makers. But Lewis wants to do something more. Right? He said, Lewis, I think we ought to consider one further step. Right? And so he's saying, why couldn't the difference just be that two things stand in a relation? Why couldn't the difference be that there's a property in one, one world that another world fundamentally lacks or something?
Yeah. Like
in other words, in other words, we need differences, but we need more fine-grained differences of some kind.
Was the Bigelow option attractive to anyone?
Lack of false makers. No,
right.
Yeah. No, I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, in that, I think it is the claim that there are no unicorns is made true by the absence of unicorns. So yeah, the lack of false makers. A unicorn is a false maker too. I'm not sure that accounts.
True, there are no unicorns. Yeah,
there
sure.
are no unicorns, right? But false makers is a weird. If I mean, it is a weird thing to introduce into your metaphysics.
Why?
Because of these things like for anything that's contingent, there's going to presumably exist a false maker for it. And then you have your, so then in any universe where there's just one atom, there's one atom and billions and billions of false makers, I guess. something like that.
For what proposition?
Yeah, or I don't know. For the proposition that there's a microwave oven, for example.
Well, no, because you don't have to have this one-to-one correspondence. It could be some blocking of inflation example as a false maker
Right.
for every other proposition, like there is a microwave in that universe, right?
Right. I mean, at least that's, I guess, I mean,
don't understand how.
Okay, so Bigelow's principle, I mean, Dave Lewis argues that it's Bigelow's principle about false makers that makes him have all these worries about unicorns and material objects, false makers for material object and contingent. Suppose there were no contingent things whatsoever. Again, there would have to be a replacement, right? There has to be a. Oh, actually, no. These are insisting on positing a truth maker. So maybe, yeah, maybe Bigelow's principle, we should just let it be. I mean, maybe all these problems are created when he says, let's know, what if we really stomp our foot and say there must be truth makers? So maybe, yeah, maybe Bigelow, I think we should read Bigelow. He sounds like it makes a lot of sense.
He does. No, but it's important. So for Bigelow, it isn't just there are truth makers that make propositions true, but if they lack false makers, they're true.
Right.
Right. That's a pretty important distinction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's read Bigelow. I that is what I lean toward now. He says, our first step backward from the full strength truthmaker principle relieved us of the burden of finding truth makers for negative existentials. Our second step relieves us of the burden of finding truth makers for predicates of fundamental properties.
Were you reading?
113, halfway down in the first.
Oh, I see. Well, after he's introduced these stronger principles, right?
Right.
Of DM and TM, which are.
Yeah.
Which are the same principles, but strengthened to include things like properties or relations.
Let's read those. So DM with two steps back, I guess, is the strike, right?
I guess, yeah. Huh.
Yeah.
For any two worlds, either something exists in one of the worlds, but not in the other, or else some n-tuple of things stands in some fundamental relation in one of the worlds, but not in the other. Okay.
I mean, since up to this point, I couldn't make sense of thing without including states of affairs. I'm not sure how much this adds, but I do.
The idea is that it's
like
not just
it
about
because
populations.
I do think that,
right?
Yeah.
It's also about their properties and relations.
But isn't a but surely including states and affairs is because we felt like we had to somehow get properties and relations into our talk of things. To make any sense at all of the truth maker principle, you had to do that, right? Because remember I was like, okay, the bear is on the mat. What's the truth maker? It can't be the bear, right? Can't be the mat. It's got to be the bear mat. Like, so it's like we needed to get a relation in there because it was a claim not about an existence. It was a claim about a relation. The bear's on the mat. So we just called that thing a state of affairs. So now we're taking out that we're saying things plus and tuples of relations. Like, isn't that just?
I'm more comfortable.
We already had relations in there.
Wait, what? We already had relations.
What do you mean?
Well, when we were setting out the truth maker principle and using the word thing, immediately we thought, well, that thing must include states of affairs.
No, I didn't.
Because what is the thing that makes the bear is on the mat true?
No, so I mean, I don't disagree with raising with the idea that concern could have been raised much earlier. That, you know, if you're only referring to objects and not also properties or perhaps other kinds of entities, that, you know, you're just not going to get a very good truth-making principle. It's just that wasn't, I mean, Lewis and the other people many of the other people he's in dialogue with are just, you know, trying to do as much as they can with objects first, I guess. And certainly
Yeah.
Lewis is always trying to do that.
The way I interpret it is that it was covered by saying that what makes it true is a bear with certain extrinsic properties, among them being on the mat. So that would be part of the bear. But that can be unsatisfying, given that we want to say that the bear is, given that we want to say that the bear is still in the world if it's not on the mat. But that's only if you take
Right.
the bear to be fully
But
determined
you
by its
can't.
intrinsic. That's only true if you take the bear to be determined only by its intrinsic properties. And that tussle, which was swept aside for the moment because there were other issues, finally emerges in section 4. So you're not wrong. It's just that they got to it only in section 4.
So basically this bear, once he's on this mat, can be in no other possible world. Because he's become the thing that makes the bears on the mat true. And by the truth maker principle, anytime he is in another world, the bears on the mat becomes true.
What you're pointing out is basically the points made in section 4.
Even if what just happened?
Yeah, you're right. But there's a reason why.
This is just a different reason to disagree with the earlier formulations, right?
Right.
Well, I mean, he does talk about.
No,
like,
I mean, this is.
He says, look, even on the previous thing where he's talking about it, truth maker principle, before introducing these things, he says, well, what would we call this unicorn? What do we call this truth maker for there is no unicorns? The absence of unicorns, the negative state of affairs, right? So he's
that's a different issue.
He's introducing the idea that by thing I could mean state of affairs.
But he's introducing it by complaining about it. So then TM, for any proposition P and any worlds W and V, blah, blah, blah. Same thing. Okay, so.
Yeah, it's the same thing, but making reference to propositions as well.
Right. So.
Oh, so he actually says that this principle has at times been advocated hesitantly by Bigelow.
I mean, you could see why there's a hesitation, maybe.
I don't know. I mean, apart from the general hesitations about properties and relations, I suppose.
Well, I mean, yes, it's that, but not worries about whether they exist, but rather whether this is a backdoor reintroduction of that which is going to have to be related to propositions by biconditionals as opposed to by a truth maker relation. Because if you're talking about one thing related to another, aren't you just restating the proposition now? That's the problem. It's essentially the same, I think, as worries about properties and relations, as you put it. I mean, what are states of affairs if not the particulars of the universals? So you don't have to talk about the universals.
The particulars of the universals?
Yeah, it's not the relation of one thing being on another, that's a universal, but rather of that bear being on that mat.
Yeah, right. But I guess it isn't just the relation, it's like the whole conglomerate of the objects, cum
altogether.
Property, cum relations, yeah.
Which is what makes it particular, right? The actual relata.
But there can be states of affairs of a cat being on a mat.
There can be what?
Right. They wouldn't be atomic, but somehow, well, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, you build them up out of the atomic ones. I mean, the point is it's particular.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how they deal with variables and stuff.
I don't either. I've never understood states of affairs except for simple propositions.
But what I'm saying is I'm giving an example. I mean, you can just have the state of affairs that is a cat being on a mat.
Yes.
And that's, an open state of affairs expression, so to speak, right?
Right.
Which which isn't, you might say, you might quantify over that, and then you wouldn't have a particular. But anyways, it's. But this isn't about states of affairs at any rate yet. It's just about properties and relations.
But it becomes about states of affairs on 113. Where
Yeah,
he
yeah,
tries
yeah.
to
We're getting
understand
there. Yeah.
you know, what it means to have for something to have a property.
Yeah, I mean, he's talking about the same things we're worried about right now. He says somehow this state
Yeah,
of affairs
I
is
want.
said to be constructed neither mereologically nor set theoretically from its constituents, F and A, F being the predicate, A being the object. I used to complain that I didn't know what this unmereological composition was, but now I think I understand it well enough because I can define it in terms of necessary connections. To say that the state of affairs is unmereologically composed is to say that nothing more or less, to say nothing more or less than necessarily it exists if and only if A has F. There's the biconditional. Yeah, then he says, my worry is that it hasn't been explained or excused. And then
My
he
only
says,
remaining complaint,
can,
is that this necessary connection between seemingly distinct existences has been in no way explained or excused. Yeah, right. So in other words,
we're going to have to bring in
Humean
the
hang-up
metaphysics
is
to modality again, he says. Yeah.
His Humean, well, right, but it's more than that. It's more like that you're going to have to bring in the metaphysics of modality, and he's looking to reduce it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, because there are people who will just say, that there are necessary connections between distinct existences, like causal relations or whatever.
Sure, but those aren't going to be,
and that aren't in themselves reduced to just like sets of worlds or something. I'm just saying that there aren't,
I get it.
modal.
Sure.
Yeah.
But those aren't going to be the kinds of necessities that will uphold the necessity of the truth maker principle. I mean, unless you think that the necessity of truth is itself baked in along with the other necessary truths of, I mean, I suppose that would be a grand theory, right?
So he says,
it's worth reading out loud, that last paragraph.
yeah. With the last or the second to last?
Isn't it the last? Shall there now be a third step backwards? Or did you want to, yeah.
Well, no, but the reason why I was just, why do we get from the stuff about, I just wanted to fill in one gap here, which is just why do we get from the stuff about properties and relations to states of affairs?
Oh.
Like, why is it that we can't just stay at have the properties and relations be included in the truth maker principle?
I think it's because properties and relations are not obvious constituents of worlds, unless you have a metaphysics of modality. It's not neutral.
I see. So the real issue is that at that point, you really do have to stop being neutral.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's fair. Okay, that makes sense. I mean, I guess the real issue is whether or not. Yeah. So I mean, I guess.
Maybe, okay,
there's a sort of, always in the background question of how much can be done neutrally versus how much can't be done neutrally.
Right. I didn't read this paper correctly, but the way I read it now is, look, I'm known for being nutty about modality. So let's see how much we can do if we're not. That's not going to work.
Yeah.
That's not going to work. You're going to need one of these. That's not available. So maybe we can rethink metaphysics of modality after all. And I think he's forcing you into it. If you want to uphold something like a truth maker principle, then you're just going to have to go some ways into a metaphysics of modality. Not necessarily his way, but you can't keep it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that sounds right. So that's sort of what this the last paragraph is about.
Right.
In a way, right? Like you're saying. Did you want to read it?
Sure. So shall there now be a third step backwards? I see no need for it. In the thesis that all contingent matters supervene on what there is, together with the pattern of instantiation of the fundamental properties and relations, I think we have reached a stable resting place. And note well, not anything goes. Worlds that supposedly differ only in their phenomenalist or behaviorist counterfactuals are still ruled out as decisively as they ever were. Can we stop there? What does he mean by that? Oh, that was in reference to an earlier point. He's basically just affirming his human supervenience. I think.
Yeah.
So likewise are worlds that differ only in their Molinist counterfactuals about the outcomes of unactualized and deterministic processes. Again, he's just insisting that worlds ought to be fully determined by the non-modal facts, right? So likewise which makes sense, right? Because if you're going to analyze modality in terms of worlds, you can't have worlds constituted by modal reality. So likewise are worlds that differ only in the lawfulness of their regularities or only in their causal relations, provided those are not fundamental. Same thing. In the case of fundamental, the reason that's excused is because of his idea of laws being just ways of summing up all the non-modal facts. So likewise are momentary worlds that differ only in their less than fundamental ersatz historical properties. I don't know what that's in reference to, but he gives a footnote. So yeah, that's all just a way of saying, I don't know what it is.
I guess he's
by
just
a third
saying,
step. What would the third step be?
I guess would that be to somehow
Oh, I see. It's that there's nothing else that needs taking care of, because all the other kinds of propositions for which we need truth makers are going to be the sort of thing for which he handles them differently in a metaphysically neutral account of modal truth. That's my guess. So he's handled, what did he handle with the two other steps, right?
Well, I think
so he says our
the
first
second
step
step
backwards.
is,
He says, I can quote it. He says our first step backward from the full strength truth maker principle relieved us of the burden of finding truth makers for negative existentials.
Right. Negatives.
Our second step relieves us also of the burden of finding truth makers for predications of fundamental properties.
Right. So can I just say, conjunction and disjunction was easy. We saw it in the other papers. Quantification is easy too, as infinite conjunction and disjunction. So what's the headache? Negation and predication. And that's what he handles in the first and second step. And once you have all those, you've got ordinary predicate logic with quantification. What else do you need? It's just going to be modal stuff. But he's got his own idea about how to handle modality.
About how you handle that, yeah. Right. Yeah, it's interesting.
This guy's amazing. And annoying. But yeah. Now I need to read the other two papers. Or actually, it's a paper and a postscript where he says, okay, well, let's suppose you go along with me on concretism. Let me see, I can show you what I can do. He makes reference to it here.
The paper to one of his papers.
Yeah, it's he says,
what
can be said on 105? What can be said from a less neutral standpoint is significantly different. See my 2003, which is at the bottom. Oh, I looked it up. Lewis 2003. Things qua truth makers. I guess you don't get anything from the title, but there it is.
Things squad truth makers, huh? Yeah.
That's right before he died.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it isn't. Yeah. So I guess the biggest upshot of this, I think, is that if you're trying to be exceedingly neutral, it's really hard to avoid coming up to the issue of states of affairs. Is that sort of like the?
I mean, I don't really have much to say about states of affairs because I've never understood them. My plan is to learn about them from Armstrong, since he's famous for it and I trust him. But my provisional understanding is that they are something like truth makers for predication. And that's consistent with what we're reading here, but not very helpful. Doesn't add anything.
Yeah, no, right. That's what I think he's sort of trying to say. Like, the moral of the story is, like, if you try and be exceedingly neutral, but also it's going to drive you in the direction of some sort of somewhat mysterious and unclear non-Humean conclusions.
Right, definitely non-human. I mean, I think originally comes from the Tractatus.
Yeah, the states of affairs business. Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't know if it
And-
existed beforehand, but I think it comes from there. Yeah.
and that's all I know. That and maybe the reason Armstrong goes for it is that he has that combinatorial notion of possibility. So you kind of have to do something like that. But that's all I know.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for him, he has a different sense of how he's going to deal with the notion of worlds and of possibility than Lewis does. Yeah. So.
Right,
But
so
then
what do we read
again,
next?
that view is not neutral, right? So.
Exactly. Right. I
It
mean,
is
at
a
least he's
view.
taking sides, right? He's got something more to say about modality and about possible worlds, and
Right.
presumably about. I mean, he doesn't tell us anything in the paper we started with. Actually, that's not true. Whenever we read it, but the Armstrong one, he says,
Yeah.
"I'll deal with modality later," and I actually have the paper, "Truth Makers for Modal Truths" or something like that by Armstrong. So we could read that, or we could read something
Yeah.
from the anthology. Do you want to decide now or later offline?
I don't know. We can decide later, I guess. I'm not sure where
Yeah,
I'm not sure where we want to. I'm not sure where we want to go with this. If we might want to read more Armstrong stuff, or Bigelow, or there's various candidates.
There's the Bigelow one. There's the how Armstrong does modality. There's the other anthology, and then there's part 2 of this one, which is the current debate. And I think that is pretty much the order in which I would be interested in reading. And I don't necessarily want to do more than 3 more papers on the topic. Of course, we could go on and read everything, but I think that's about as much as I want. Josh, Karen?
Yeah, I was just looking through the current debate section, and there's a couple. Truth Makers as Correspondence looks interesting. There's a Paul. Did I just look? I should look at the table of contents instead of flipping back and forth frantically.
Horwich has the minimalist theory of truth that I've always wanted to read more about, because Davidson's 2 big papers on truth, where he says, I don't like this and I don't like that, has like a page where he says, correspondence isn't going to work unless Horwich figures out what he's working on, but I'm doubtful. And I thought, well, maybe that'll work. And I always wanted to look further.
Well,
That's as far as I got.
Truth Making and Correspondence is chapter 8 by Marion David, and then there's Being in Truth by Paul Horwich on chapter 10.
Yeah.
Well, I was interested to try and find something about the relationship between truth making and grounding, but I don't know if that's in any of the
There's facts and
anthologies we have,
relations.
because it's a sort of more recent thing, I think.
Yeah, that sounds a little, I don't know. And then there's the other anthology. Let's just decide offline.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
All right.